Welcome to the podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Today we're going to discuss the explosion of college sports journalism, and in particular, the incredible work being done by independent writers. For many, this is a labor of love. For some lucky ones, they are able to make a living out of their entrepreneurial efforts. Subscriptions range from free up to $9 or $10 a month, promising to deliver unique and well-researched content to the sports industry and their followers. My guest today is Andy Wittry, writer and editor of the newsletter Out of Bounds. I have been following Andy's detailed work for as long as it's been available, and I am intrigued by not only his unique writing style, but also the kinds of journalistic rabbit holes he finds himself in. He works for Turner Sports as a men's basketball reporter alongside his weekly newsletter. He has worked previously, had been published in Sports Illustrated, Sporting News, Stadium, the Indianapolis Star, Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and Athletic Director U. He's a proud graduate of Indiana University with a degree in journalism. And Andy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Karen. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this is awesome. So let's start with a little bit of breaking news that you're going to have tomorrow morning, January 15th, in your newsletter. You wrote on Twitter a couple of hours ago, 2 ACC women's basketball programs have now opted out of the season. For tomorrow's newsletter, you're writing about the ACC school's faculty athletics committee that, quote unquote, found every excuse when a member asked the committee to consider whether continuing the season is responsible. Tell us more about this story.
Yeah, so in the wake of Florida men's basketball player Keontae Johnson, him collapsing on December 12th against Florida State, my curiosity was, what are athletic directors potentially doing, or what are they discussing in the wake of that collapse? And obviously this is a very, sensitive issue that we don't know exactly what happened. And I think that's the biggest question for me, is this is out of our range, of our scope, of what exactly caused this collapse. But to me, it's not just the question itself of what happened, but why aren't people asking that question? So kind of going meta of the question about the question. So one email that I found was that it's a professor named Jay Smith. So he works for University of North Carolina. He specializes in, I think it's early France and French culture, but he's also taught a course called Big Time College Sports and the Rights of Athletes. And he is on the faculty athletics committee at the University of North Carolina. And so they work with the chancellor and kind of discussing big picture issues on athletics and students. And, it can vary certainly from school to school on what discussions they have and what's their impact, but kind of almost like an advisory council, if you will. So he sent on December 23rd, that was the day that the first men's basketball program that attempted to start the season then opted out, which was Chicago State. So on December 23rd, he sent an email to the committee. And he said, I personally believe it's irresponsible to continue playing college basketball right in the teeth of the worst virus spikes we're going to see over the entire history of this pandemic, with numerous players and evidently at least one team already affected in serious ways by the viral spread. No less a luminary than Mike Krzyzewski evidently feels the same way. I want to urge that we, as a committee, at least the faculty members on the committee, consider A, whether we collectively believe it is responsible for universities to continue to do what they are doing, and B, if we need to issue a statement about it. If other players collapse because of myocarditis in the weeks/months ahead, to say nothing of the obvious long-term risks, I, for one, will feel terribly guilty for not having tried harder to stop this. So that was his email initially. And actually, I reached out to Jay and I said, hey, came across your email via a public records request. Would love to hear more if you have any, additional updates or insight on the issue. And he responded back, and I'm scrolling here, sorry. So they met, I don't have the exact day, but sometime in early to mid January, so maybe like a week and a half ago or so. And his follow-up, he said that there were few members of the FAC who were even interested in asking follow-up questions. This was after they had a doctor from the athletic department who met with the committee and gave them a presentation. Jason, it was a very long presentation. So he said that very few members even had follow-up questions. Then he said, quote, there was, to be candid, no, in all caps, no appetite for disrupting basketball here. None. That is, other than mine. As a committee, we found every excuse. The players want to play. They could get sick if they weren't playing. Our doctors are great, etc. Not to act. It was dispiriting, even though this was typical of faculty athletic committees all across the country, end quote. So there it just shows, and the bigger picture for me, once again, it's not just a question of what happened to Keontae, because, I write in the story that I think that, once again, as a non-medical professional, I think that maybe the best case scenario is that this has nothing to do with COVID-19, that I think if we could extrapolate, you would hope that this is just a terrible isolated incident, right? Where it's his genetic makeup. It was the exertion level on that one day, that hopefully it was a one-time awful incident that he can hopefully recover fully from and get back on the court and live a healthy, full life. Because if it is connected, then you do kind of the big picture analysis of who else could fall under that. Whatever happened to Keontae, who else could this apply to? And this is a virus that I believe as of yesterday, the New York Times numbers was like 230 some thousand new cases reported. And so you look at, even if young, otherwise healthy adults could be affected by this, it gets to a really troubling place. So this isn't trying to create a war over medical records we don't have, but it's a question of why aren't more people asking the questions, right? It's the question about the question. And so to use the anecdote from Jay and from UNC is that, he said these are professors, these are people who work in higher education, that, this isn't the head coach, this isn't the athletic trainer, this is people that, sure, they work at a big time D1 institution that has successful, a men's basketball program and other successful programs, but it's like they don't have that same stake that you'd expect of, this isn't a head coach saying it, this isn't the AD saying it, this is people that, their paycheck doesn't depend on them winning games or winning championships. And he said they had no appetite for changing. And once again, it wasn't, you could tell that Jay felt the personal qualms of, should we have a season? But his initial point was like, should we consider this? It wasn't, we need to stop tomorrow or today. It was, we at least have this discussion. And I measured, using Google Trends, you can see the popularity of certain search terms. And so, just as being someone who's very online and working, in digital media, I'm curious of how are searches for just the name Keontae Johnson, how have those changed since the days since? And the way that Google Trends works is that the peak interest, it's labeled as a 100, so, maximum volume. And so 50 would be 50%, a value of 1 would be 1%. And so the day after his collapse, December 13th, that was for the 30-day span from December 11th through January 10th. The 13th was this maximum search day, so a value of 100. And I found that 8 days after that, it was a value of 3, and 9 days after was a value of 1. So basically and he was still in the hospital, I think. He was released 10 days after. So he was still hospitalized that day where there was that 3% search interest. And so basically it looks like, within a week and a half, 2 weeks after his collapse and his hospitalization, is it essentially Google, its own analytics, the number is so small it can barely track how much search interest there was. Some days it says less than 1, so just marginal interest. And it's really a shame because I Googled, I think this was 2 days ago. So basically, I think 29 days after his collapse, just typed in Keontae Johnson, press search. And the number one, Google has like the recommended questions of like people also ask. So the number one question was, is Keontae Johnson still alive?
Oh, wow.
And that was the number one. This isn't, some media scheme. This is Google's analytics of like, what are people searching, right? And you know that if people search Keontae Johnson, the number one question they want to ask is he still alive? The next question is, how tall is he? The third question was, how old is he? So it's, it's basically, it's almost like your NBA draft profile of, okay, how tall is he? When was he born? And then, is he still alive? So that's where, for me, it's just, once again, it's not, we're not trying to weaponize, or I'm not trying to weaponize someone's, health status or medical records, but it's the big picture of why aren't people asking the question?
I don't know whether that search result led to them releasing statement that he's now coaching, and they had a very energetic picture of him clapping on the sidelines, urging his teammates on, and it sort of gave the impression was he's doing great. He's here coaching every day at practice. No need to worry. Nothing to see here. Move along now. But it doesn't address what you're asking, which is what happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then also just to add this in too, just in case there was any, any part of this that wasn't clear. This was it was the Gainesville Sun. So they were citing, it was a source with firsthand knowledge. They said that he was diagnosed with acute myocarditis that, quote, that may be related to an earlier infection for COVID-19. So just in case that wasn't clear, that there was which we have no reason to dispute that there was, a direct source that they're quoting. And so once again, this has been a disease. This was part of the Big Ten impactful decision back in August, right? Of what's the connection and how significant is the connection from COVID-19 to myocarditis. So once again, it's tough because it's the nation, or at least, the whole point is there were a lot of people initially that were really concerned, and understandably, but based on the metrics we have and anecdotes like Jay Smith at UNC and just individual media coverage or the lack thereof, is that it feels like it took a week, if that, for the interest just to plummet. And, I cite those reasons like, it's the fact that he got released. And like you mentioned, that he's now a coach and you're seeing him. So maybe it's subconscious where, okay, we see him, he's out of the hospital, he's on 2 feet, he's smiling. There was a video of him dancing with teammates, like all, positive signs. But that shouldn't erase the bigger questions too about, what happened? Like, why is he a coach? It's great to see him out there on the sideline and, he's in an unofficial student coach role, but there's still the biggest question is, why is he a coach? And then the question I'm asking is, why aren't more people asking that question?
And it gets into two things. One thing I do want to say is I had a conversation with a cardiologist back in late August, early September. And I said, okay, this whole thing with myocarditis is starting to scare me. What are you thinking about? And he goes, and this is just one cardiologist's opinion, but he said, there are a lot of viruses that can cause myocarditis. COVID-19 is not the only one. So that's something that we have to be aware, is that the flu could cause it, the cold could cause it, a variety of other things could cause it. But secondly, it gets to more your point about the right to know. What are we allowed to know as the general public about his condition? I was just having this conversation with someone else. We were talking about FERPA, and colleges and universities seem to have vastly different understandings of what FERPA covers, what they're allowed to release, what they're not allowed to release. That's got to be frustrating for you as a journalist to try to find these things out.
It is, and especially this case here with Keontae, is that this is actually one of the not rare situations, but this is one of the undisputably one of the situations where whatever FERPA, HIPAA, all those laws, they should reasonably uphold here. Like, we should not have access to his medical information. We shouldn't get that in public records requests. We shouldn't get that just from an email. Like, all those hold up. But it's also the case of the ramifications and the impact of, even though we don't have a legal obligation to have access to that information, the greater good should still dictate that if there is takeaway, positive or negative, if they say that there's no connection between COVID-19 and, his hospitalization, we should know that too, right? That should be reassuring. It should be settling. So it goes both ways, where if there is a clear connection, we should know that. And if there's clearly not, we should also, that's reassuring. That's good news, right? So it cuts both ways. And it's tough because we don't need, like, there was the whole Adam Schefter tweet from like 4 or 5 years ago where he had Jason Pierre-Paul's hospital record when he blew up his finger with a firework. Right. And there was a different patient too, who was not an NFL player, just some random American. And I think that part of his information was tweeted by Adam Schefter. And so it's not just the player, but it's some random guy out there who's just living, and now part of his record is out there on Twitter. And it's like, we shouldn't have access to some athlete's medical history or their lab results or stuff like that. But it's also, there's a greater good in the public interest of the school. There should be a duty and obligation to share what they know. And now it's just, you have to put your faith in the institution, in his family, his doctors, their assistant ADs, the doctors, that they're going to share that information. So there's no reason to suspect they won't, but it's also, is there being the pressure applied that will then compel them to share that, in a timely and transparent basis?
I hear two things. I hear one, we want to not be afraid to have the conversation, which is what Jay Smith was saying to his colleagues. And why aren't we at least having the conversation? Because there seems to be a real fear, and that's why people shut it down. And then the second thing is, maybe we don't know enough yet. And that's not the answer we want to give, because if we don't know enough yet, then it calls into question, why are we doing this if we don't know enough yet? So schools seem to be backing away from just saying no comment. It's just easier not to comment.
Yeah, no, it's great. We need to say, this is FERPA or this is HIPAA, sorry, we can't comment. And I think it was the New York Times. There's some stories out there over the summer of just the level to which schools often hide behind these laws. And once again, they're important when, applied properly, these are important laws. We shouldn't be giving out, students academic information or medical records. Like the laws exist for a reason, but it's the application and the use. And I think also the level to which media sites and just journalists maybe either don't know the laws well enough themselves, or they just feel the pressure of like, okay, well, big state, you said that I can't have this information due to FERPA. I'm not going to push back. Or if they did, and if they have, the financial means, the legal means, they could probably win that fight oftentimes. But if they don't know any better or feel, bullied by the school, they might just back down.
Yeah, yeah. So since we're talking about some alphabet soup here, we're talking about FERPA, we're talking about HIPAA, let's talk about FOIA, which is Freedom of Information Act requests. And you use that a lot to support your writing. So tell our listeners who may not know, how does that process work from your perspective as a journalist?
Well, it's certainly not a glamorous process. It's lots of, late Sunday nights where I'm going to say, I'll send 20 to 50 emails tonight. And it's kind of a shotgun approach. So basically what FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, is that it allows these state universities as, public funded institutions, is that they have a duty with the state public records laws that there's certain documents, correspondences, contracts that are public knowledge, they're public records. And so there are exceptions, once again, getting back to, HIPAA and FERPA and all that stuff. But in terms of, employment contracts, emails, text messages, contract, like all this different stuff, a lot of that is public record, and it may be subject to redactions. It may cost money at times to fulfill the request or to, to get the records you're looking for. But it's a basic checks and balances function for journalists, for the public. Like, you don't have to be a journalist. You could be, John or Jane Doe out there, and just, it's the barrier to entry is not high. Like, once you learn how to do it, it's very simple. The laws vary by state. Some you have to be an in-state resident, and you have to prove, you have residence in that state. But it's a similar process of basically how specific can you get of which employees you're looking for their emails, or what's the date range, what dates, what are the key search terms. So for me, is that, I should go through and track, like, what is my success rate or the hit rate, because it may only be 20 or 30%, which is why I send so many. And you look at, different conferences, different schools, different employees, and it might take a week. This Iowa story I published last week, they got back to me, I think, like 7 months later. So it's not a quick process. I mean, it can be, but it's not. Certainly for bigger requests and more potential information that's more sensitive to a school, they might certainly take their time in providing that information to a time where it's of less news interest or less value to you as a reporter. But it's one where, I might send, 20, 50, 80 a week. And then, you wait 1 month, 2 months, 6 months. And then hopefully at that point, maybe a quarter of those, you can use that information and hopefully, use it to boost a story, or you can find stuff. A lot of times it's almost like playing Battleship, where there's a certain thing of value in a certain area, right, and you have to get lucky, right? So there's probably, I think my newsletter, I've published almost 60 editions so far. And I would say that probably between 20 and 25 have been subjects where I was not looking for that information, but I simply just got lucky and found it. Like, I was looking, if I can say, like, hopefully a smart, interesting angle or story idea. And because I asked that question and filed that request, I just got lucky and found something else while I was there. Yeah. And so it's not even, you might have like a good idea going in, but you find an even better idea on the backside. So there's a benefit just to kind of showing up, just asking the question, and then see what comes back to you.
That's very cool. So let's talk about the Iowa program. The football program's strength and conditioning coach came under fire back in August, I think it was. And there was a lot of initial coverage, but then you picked up on some racist language, behaviors by members of the football staff, and even the perception that the head coach was complicit in creating an environment where those behaviors went unchecked for years. Take us into this reporting and into the FOIAs that you were able to get.
Yeah, so the initial allegations, this all started in the wake of George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis. So I believe it was, June 1st, George Floyd was murdered on, I think, May 25th. So just in kind of, the week following, is that Iowa head coach Kirk Ferentz met with the team. I think that he read off a statement or had a statement prepared about just kind of the growth they could have both individually and as a team in terms of, listening more, learning, and just trying to, grow as people, grow as teammates, all certainly commendable, goals and values. And of course, as I wrote, so many of the discussions about race in the last half decade in America, especially as regards, to sports, they've centered around the idea of kneeling or not kneeling for the national anthem. And so I think that what Kirk Ferentz had said was that we either want to all kneel or have no one kneel. It's like, let's make this a team, a unified statement. And it was current Chicago Bears lineman James Daniels, and he had quote tweeted a reporter's tweet about that sentiment. And he had said, if the team collectively decides to all kneel, to the effect of this would be a major step forward in terms of kind of progress and cultural improvement for Iowa. And that was kind of when the first crack in the dam, if you will. And then a few days later, I think it was June 3rd, was the first time there was a mention of former strength and conditioning coach Chris Doyle and his behavior. And I think the total number was like 55 or 60 former players, most of whom are Black, who made these allegations. Some specific, some just kind of more general about, there's a racial disparity. And then some were more specific to, certain coaches or certain, language or actions. And it kind of created this culture, in the words of the allegations of, there was this whole concept of the Iowa way, which is based around kind of the white Midwestern player, clean cut, suburban backgrounds. And it was one that Black players felt like they couldn't fit that standard. And so there was an independent investigation. It was the Kansas City-based law firm Hush Blackwell, and they released a report, I think in September. It was a 28-page report. And it was interesting too, because the school didn't ask them to confirm the veracity of any of the claims. It was basically, can you go in and give us like a feeling of the culture and how players feel? So the metaphor I kind of thought of was like the law firm, based on the way that I read this report, was that they were asked to go to the kitchen and take a temperature of the room, not find out, was there a fire on the stove? So it wasn't to determine, did these specifics happen? It was more of like, was it 105 degrees in there? If that makes sense. It was interesting too, because it said in the main report, they noted there were 4 personnel reports additionally that were based on the specific claims. So I don't think, once again, it didn't determine did they happen, but it went into like those specific allegations. And I've requested twice for those documents, both times denied, in part due to FERPA. So back to kind of bring this conversation full circle. And, in this bigger report, they mentioned that there were 3 coaches who specifically were cited repeatedly as kind of the ones that conducted the bullying, the racial language, the very specific allegations. So you would assume that 3 of those 4 kind of separate reports are those 3 individuals. And then you'd probably assume the 4th one is someone in a position of power above those 3. I would assume, if that's a reasonable assumption, that whether that's a coach or it's an administrator or it's someone at the university level, that's my best guess. So that's what we're left with, is that by the time that this, records request was fulfilled and sent back, the season's over. So I mentioned, at this point, Iowa, they won their last 6 games. They finished 15th in the playoff rankings. They can kind of now move on, and they can sell that we're on a 6-game winning streak. We were a top 15 team, all this stuff. And wins are great, but it's also like the way that the program moved on. Because it's also ironic that there was only, I believe, only one coach, which was the strength coach, Chris Doyle, that left the program in the immediate aftermath of these allegations. And he signed a separation agreement. He walked away with $1.1 million. He was previously the highest paid strength and conditioning coach in the country at $800,000 per year. So you ask, what does that agreement mean, legally? And some kind of the bigger picture questions about the volume and the nature of those allegations were pretty substantial, I would say. And people mentioned in this report that there's former players that said, to the effect of, this is not just a Chris Doyle allegation or issue. This is not just a culture based around our belief about his behavior. And then he's the only one that has since moved on from the school, however you want to phrase his separation agreement. So it's interesting, the fact that the players said that to the investigation, to the reporters for the investigation. And then you had fans too in the emails that I uncovered. They also said, don't let this be just, and not all of them, but many said, don't let this be just Chris Doyle. Some asked for head coach Kirk Ferentz to lose his job. Mm-hmm. Some asked for Kirk Ferentz's son, Brian, the offensive coordinator, that he should lose his job. One fan went as far as to say, we all know that Brian won't lose his job, and we know why, making allegations of nepotism. And this fan wrote that to the athletic director, Gary Barta. So this has all been, not hidden, but it's been a long process. If it's taken 7 months for kind of the full picture of the players, the former players, the fans, and in part just due to the delay of the fact that I submitted this back in early to mid-June, and it came back in January, and at this point it's number 15 Iowa 6-2, and so what does this all mean, and has this gotten lost?
Well, it's a good question, and oftentimes we see football programs sort of expunge the most obvious person and then just kind of close ranks and stop talking about it and hope it goes away. That's why I thought the timing of this was interesting, because it's like, what really has been done to address the issues that you say a number of athletes brought up, and over a consistent period of time, not just over one particular season, but and Kirk Ferentz is one of the longest serving head football coaches in the country. So is this systemic in that program, systemic in the department? I mean, those are always good questions, especially in light of George Floyd and everything that we've been going through with racial justice this year.
Definitely. And to me it was ironic because in a very specific context of ranking football teams, which maybe there was a weird joy in getting angry about that this year, of just the distraction of my team's better than your team, or your team's better than my team, whatever. But the fact that, Barta, he was named the college football playoff chairman for the selection committee. And so it's this guy that I think that he was hired, I believe, in 2006, 2007, somewhere in that range. And this wasn't the first incident or allegation or settlement regarding diversity and inclusion, or player safety. There's been issues related to rowing, I believe, field hockey. There was the case of Rhabdo back in 2011 when 13 football players were hospitalized. Some had discolored urine. This is the whole the kidney, not disease, but kidney issue, where it's potential kidney damage related to kind of overexertion and too much training. And so it's almost the irony that, once again, a lot of these things were alleged, and the school's own independent report, they didn't look to confirm if this stuff happened. It was more of like, what's the culture, what's the mood around the program. But you take some of the issues that happened this summer that were alleged, plus the previous ones over the past 10 or 15 years, and then you have he's on national TV once a week, and I wrote that in the context of ranking football teams, the reporters, I thought, actually asked him some very tough questions this year about why some of the smaller schools didn't potentially get the respect or the credit they deserved, where the bigger schools did. And so in the context of, once again, just ranking football teams, he was asked tough questions. But in the scheme of the stuff that happened in June, the stuff that happened in 2011, the stuff that happened before that, is it ranking football teams? It's fun, it's part of the sport, but it's not in the context of what 2020 was. That was such a small issue. And so it's like you have, and I get that ESPN was not having him on there to discuss allegations of racism or allegations of nepotism or about the settlement agreement, all this stuff. But it's just like, it was the irony of, like, you have someone that potentially deserves to be asked numerous difficult questions on diversity, on racism, on allegations of nepotism, and he's being asked about number 7 Cincinnati, which in the context that makes sense. But it was the bigger picture of this guy. There's a lot that could and should be asked of him, and a lot that has been asked, but there's still more that needs to be answered. And he's now the face of the playoff committee, which is really, I think, just the paradox of those two different sides is really interesting.
Yeah. Well, that's absolutely astute journalism. Let me briefly ask you about this latest newsletter that you you decided to go looking at bios, just the way people write their bios on the websites. And you had an interesting journey counting up the number of times certain names were mentioned. And it got me thinking about these, I was calling them trigger words or phrases that college athletic administrators use that signify somehow that they have more authority or more knowledge than others. Is this a better status or a higher status because you have football mentioned more often in your bio? What was your takeaway from that?
Yeah, this is actually, and not to divert us off course too much, but it's actually, the timing is interesting, because the reason why I thought of this idea, it dates back to, I think, almost 2.5 years ago. So when Urban Meyer was still the head coach at Ohio State, is that they had the former wide receivers coach, Zach Smith, who was alleged to have committed, domestic violence or domestic abuse. And he was the grandson of Earl Bruce, the former Ohio State head coach. Right. And in Urban Meyer's bio, and I think you can still find this actually to this day, is that there were probably 6 or 7 sentences, so like 3 paragraphs, that were devoted on Meyer's bio to Earl Bruce, of how basically he had called him, the second biggest mentor in his life besides his father, or like, the second biggest father figure in his life. And I found that was maybe quietly telling, the fact that there was alleged to have been improper reporting or a lack of reporting of what Urban Meyer knew about the Zach Smith allegations. And when you know that those have been alleged, and you know that Urban places a supreme respect and confidence and admiration of Earl Bruce, and that Zach Smith is then, Earl Bruce's grandson, kind of the transitive property there, I thought that was potentially telling of just how things unfolded.
Yeah.
I'm glad that I waited until this moment to kind of look at AD bios of just what 2020 was for college athletics, of programs getting cut. You had staffers making 40K or 60K a year who might get laid off, who might have a salary reduction that hurts them a lot more than the coaches making 250,000 or 1.2 million or whatever the case may be. And it was this conflict, social justice, athlete move, like all these different events just kind of compiled in the same 6 or 9 month kind of like stretch. And so it brings us to the case where you have these bios, and I don't know, you ask what language is used to kind of show extra knowledge or influence or power. And I don't know what the actual, my mom discusses like intent versus impact, right? Of like, what are someone's intentions and what's the impact of their actions? And I think the intent, at a basic level, it's probably pretty similar as you and I. If we're going to update our resume or update our LinkedIn description, I don't know that the average AD, their process is that much different than you and I, of like, you want to show off your best traits, your best accomplishments, you want specific action verbs, you want metrics, when available. So certain, for them, it's often, money raised or a certain square footage for a facility, stuff like that, where, for me, I might talk about subscribers for my newsletter or page views or stuff like that. So it's all kind of the same process, but I think for them, it's more eyeballs, it's a bigger platform, more money involved, obviously. And so it was just basically taking, they're kind of finely worded, like this wasn't an accident. Like these aren't just word salads of either they spent hours probably poring over the bios, or it was a communication staff or PR person that helped them like walk through, okay, what was your career like? How did you get to this step, and what led you to get hired here, and all this stuff. And so when you kind of basically take all the action verbs and the achievements and the honors, and then basically just analyze that of like which words and phrases were used the most often, that's when you find out it's like, okay, well, football is going to get mentioned 6 times per bio, and you're going to have an average of $4 signs per biography and all this stuff. So I don't know, I think the actions behind the words are real. So when they mention a certain, a fundraising arm of the athletic department, or there's a certain, AD of the year award they won, I think the actions behind that are certainly telling, but it's kind of tough to parse like what words are more important or which ones carry more weight. And that gets the impact. Like we know the intent of like, you're trying to, show off the best side of yourself. You might want to get a bigger, better job, or, get a raise someday, get certain awards. But what is the actual impact of the way that you wrote that? It might get you in the door, like a resume would for any job, of like, there's a pile of like the throwaway pile, there's the immediate yes pile, like we want to contact them back. And then, the maybe pile of, if the definite yes pile is too small, we might go to the maybe pile and then find someone else. So I think it might get you in the door to a bigger job or a certain honor, or might get you considered for, the college football playoff committee, whatever the case may be. But I don't know the actual, if you use this verb versus that verb, or if you talk about swimming more than the average AD, like I don't know what the actual impact is,
Well, you just actually hit on something, because, as somebody who oversaw human resources in a Division I athletic department, has hired numerous coaches over the years, it got me thinking about, when we scan, and that's what we do, we give most resumes and cover letters 30 seconds, 60 seconds, we're looking for key words. So if someone who wants to be an AD puts in their resume, I've had this experience with football, I've had this experience with football, emphasizing the word football, 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 and then maybe fundraising, 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 does that get more weight in someone's consideration for how they're perceived by not only the person who's hiring them, but also the general fan base who thinks, okay, they either have credibility or they don't have credibility. If they've never worked with football, then how can you possibly run a department with football? So it just got me thinking about, how people present themselves and the kinds of words that can lead to possibly somebody being hired and somebody not being hired. I thought it was a very interesting study.
Yeah, no, I think that's smart. The whole concept of like directing your work, your resume, your appearance based on the client or based on the audience. So if you're going to work for, an SEC institution, yeah, you better hammer home football. You better hammer home, boosters and fundraising facilities, that kind of stuff. But then, like, let's say you're going to a Big East school, you better prioritize basketball. Still fundraising and boosters, but like the same football. Not that the skills that you used in maybe a football athletic department or in the department at a football school would still matter. But if you're going to Villanova, which they have FCS football, so it's not that football doesn't matter. But
Right.
if you know that they're kind of their crown jewel is men's basketball, is that you might want to cater your skill set, your audience towards that. You're
Exactly.
the same for if it's Xavier, which doesn't have football, you might want to hammer home men's and women's basketball or
Right.
men's soccer or baseball. And
Right.
I know Stanford actually they cut, I think, what it was, maybe 16 or 18 sports. They
11,
announced those
11.
cuts last year, but
Yeah.
still for a Pac-12 school, maybe it's more of it's the breadth of, I've worked with 26 different sports in my career. And maybe you mentioned more of women's sports of our women's track and field team won 3 conference championships in 4 years, or it's our it's our international student population or student athlete population. Like, I do think there's a takeaway there in terms of how, like, if I apply to a job, if there's one job where it's covering Clemson, I wouldn't word that resume and cover letter the same as one that's maybe covering high school sports in California, right? Like, you need to know your audience and how you, it would still be the same me and the same, like, my background, but I think the way that you would pick and choose, your resume, your highlights, maybe what metrics or what experiences you discuss in a cover letter, I think that certainly changes.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. When I applied, I was in Division 1 and then I worked in Division 3. And I know that the folks in Division 3 were glad that I had managed a $12 million budget, but that didn't matter in Division 3. What mattered is I was student athlete focused and that type of thing. Andy, in the remaining time we have, a lot has come out of this last year, 2020. What have we learned from COVID-19, do you think, in the college sports perspective? And what would you like college presidents and trustees to have learned from your work that you've been able to do?
Yeah, and I think to kind of piggyback off that whole the biography story and to kind of use that is that I think we learned. I don't know how much. I think we did learn a lot, but I think a lot was, it was made so obvious that we saw it for what it was. Just the whole college athletics ecosystem about who holds power, what sports really matter, where the money goes, where the money doesn't go.
Yeah.
Is that kind of, to use this this AD biography story, is that we learned that, yeah, football matters a whole heck of a lot. And at a lot of schools, wrestling or tennis or track and field may not matter too much, no matter what they say. And not that it brings them joy to cut those sports or to not renovate the stadium, but you just, what's the cash cow, what truly matters. So I think, the metaphor I used was, it was almost like the 2020, calendar year and the 2021 academic year. It was almost like a page in Where's Waldo, but it's just Waldo on a snow-covered mountain. Like, no other features, no people. It's just, you can't mistake it. Like, it's there. It's laid bare. Like, and it's not that everyone's evil. It's not that they're all out to cut sports or to make lives difficult for female athletes or people of color. There's certainly, there have been allegations about very specific, like, to use Iowa, there was allegations that Iowa's culture was not suitable or beneficial to Black athletes. So there are certainly individual cases, but it's not like, I wrote for the 80 story. I'm not trying to like cast everyone in a bad light. It's just, let's use the data that you provide us. Like, you chose those words. Let's take that and learn from it. And so we learned how much facilities matter. Like the fact that I had said that facilities were mentioned if they were a sport, basically, less than basketball, but more than baseball. So basically football, basketball facilities. And so we can learn from that if you're going to recruit at the highest level and you're going to continue, raising money and winning championships, is it facilities, like the actual impact of what does a nicer locker room get you, like tangibly, maybe just more space, but it's what does that represent of, additional fundraising and, potentially higher recruits and stuff like that. And then what we learned, or what we hopefully learn going forward, I would say hopefully just listen to athletes. And it sounds simple, and I know a lot of administrators and coaches do or think they do. But I think if we look at, the We Are United post from the Pac-12 athletes back in August, is that, they had called those demands in their post on the Players Tribune. And when the Pac-12 referenced, like very initially in the days after, they put demands in quotes. And it's a small thing, but it's the fact that, like, if you look at the definition of the word demands, like that's a forceful, serious, like that's not like, like ask or like, request, like it's demand. It's a very strong, forceful word. And even seeing the fact that Pac-12 put demands in quotes, it just showed that they weren't going to take that request probably as serious as they should have. And, they got past it. The only, only concessions, if you will, were the chance to opt out and not lose your scholarship. And then the chance to come back for a 5th year, or to have your, your rolling clock extended by 1 year. But it's the fact there's so many other concerns about, is it long-term medical health insurance? Is it maybe that you should have a 6-year scholarship, just blanket of why, if the whole importance and the point is higher education, or at least that's what the system tells us, then why force an athlete out too soon, especially if they're in a graduate program that might take 2 years, but their athletic scholarship ends after that 1st year of grad school. Are they going to get that grad degree or not? So there's lots of good points, and it gets into name, image, and likeness rights down the road. Is there some sort of collective bargaining or revenue sharing, which I know those are big scary topics that you can't talk about or can't ever consider for college athletics. But I think given how quickly things could pick up this decade in terms of expanded athletes' rights, and the fact that Congress is getting involved because the NCAA has kind of dug its heels in and not been receptive to real meaningful change in those areas, I would just hope that administrators, presidents, whomever, like seriously listens to the athletes, because they have a voice. They taught us that this summer. They've probably always had one. They've just been punished or shut down before it reached the public, before Twitter existed. So I would just hope that they get an open, friendly ear. That's all.
I couldn't agree more. I really think the athlete's voice is probably going to be the #1 story for the next 4 or 5 years. I really, really do. Annie Witry, thank you so much for spending some time with us. And I'll be sure to put a link to your blog or your newsletter in my show notes. And keep up the great writing, man. I really just enjoyed it. And you tackle some fascinating subjects. So thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, Karen. Really appreciate it.
You're welcome.